everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves through consultation round 2 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities or are of community importance, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. With me today and many other shows going forward is Jennifer Ashwazage Pereira, my colleague and an Indigenous engagement and traditional knowledge specialist at Atkins Realis. Jennifer is also a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, which, if you don't know, is located on the French River south of Sudbury, and works with me on our projects across Canada. So, hi, Jen. Welcome aboard again.
Morning. Thank you,
Good to have you
Miigwech.
here. And we've got a good topic today. I know you've got some lots of things to say, which is great. So
Yeah, we have lots of things to talk about.
we sure do. So let's get started. And uh, today we're going to talk about a topic that sort of isn't an issue right now, but it will be as the projects, the all season road project gets closer to actual construction. The topic's about minimizing project impacts, and it's really sort of around helping to explain how to mitigate project effects or project impacts. Mitigate is a word we use a lot in the environmental assessment and impact assessment world, and that's really what it means, is to minimize project impacts, and in some cases, it eliminates project impacts. So we really think it's important to discuss these kinds of topics because it helps community members understand that once an environmental assessment or impact assessment um, uh, reaches the approval stage, if it does, there's a lot that goes on afterwards in terms of ensuring that the commitments in the environmental assessment are followed through on. So let's move into our presentation today. I'll run through today's topics. If we can switch to that slide, please. And that's the next slide. So we're going to talk a bit, as we always do, just to give everyone a bit of a background on the project, just to remind everyone. Then we're going to talk about introduction to environmental management plans um, during both construction and operations. If we can go back one slide, please. We're going to talk about EMP or environmental management plan components. And we're going to talk about what's inside an environmental management plan, the specific types of plans that sit within the overall environmental management plans. And then we're going to talk towards the end about just examples of simple mitigation measures using erosion and sediment control as an example. And then the final slide that we're going to go over is environmental management plan enforcement and compliance. So use of community environmental monitors. So let's dive in. Talk a bit about where the project is. Webequie Supply Road is located. Webequie itself is located between 200 and 250 kilometers of Hudson Bay and James Bay, and the road would travel from the airport in Webequie to the southeast to the McFalds Lake area in the Ring of Fire area. In terms of the purpose of the Webequie Supply Road, three main purposes. One is to move materials, supplies, and people from the airport to the area where the development and exploration activity is and will be occurring. Another purpose is to provide, of course, employment and economic development opportunities to Webequie community members, while at the same time allowing them to continue to live in their community and preserve their language and culture. And then finally, to provide experience and training opportunities for younger people to encourage them to pursue additional skills training and post-secondary education as well too. So those are
Yeah,
the
and
three
now's a
main
good time
purposes.
for that.
It
Right,
certainly is.
Don?
You're right.
Now's a good time to
You're
start
exactly
talking
right, Jen.
about that because we're more than halfway through this process now. In under 3 years, once things could be approved and there could be construction starting. So there's
And you
lots
know
to
what,
think
Jen?
about
That's
in
one
this
of our
area.
Yeah, and that's one of our future topics is going to talk a little bit about opportunities, right? The types of
Hmm.
jobs that would be created, and a little bit about the training, and I think we're going to probably have more topics. I think down, further along that sort of expand on that to help members sort of see what's coming and understand how they can prepare for it. So yeah, 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 you're right. You're exactly right about that. Next slide, please, just to describe the project. Um, so the Webco Supply Road is 107 kilometers long. It's 17 kilometers of that sits within the reserve lands themselves. We are working with what you call a preliminary corridor, preferred corridor, which is a 2 kilometer wide band of land within which the road would sit. So that's sort of our planning area, and that road would sit within there. The actual area that would be cleared for the road is 35 meters wide.
That's pretty
Next
wide.
slide, please. Yeah, it's pretty wide, but not super wide. There are other road corridors that are quite a bit wider than that, but
Hmm.
sometimes they're built right to accommodate other infrastructure too, like transmission lines and things like that. So
Well, that's it. And
um,
we're trying to keep it narrow to just do minimal
limit the
construction
impact.
on the land. Yeah.
You got it exactly. That's you don't. There's no need to clear more than necessary, really, right? For to have a huge project footprint for something that where the actual area that's needed is not that great.
Right. It's not going to
Just
be
an
Highway 400.
No, no, fortunately not. Just to add a bit to that, there would be three major crossings. The first one would be coming out of Webequie would be across Winisk Lake, so it's about 200 to 250 meters wide. The second one is Winisk's Channel, which is 30 to 50 meters wide. And the third one is at the eastern end of the road called the Mukatai River, and it's about 30 to 50 meters wide. And as I always say, it's more than just a road. It involves other infrastructure in its development. Some of it's temporary, some of it's permanent. So there would be other facilities that would be built as part of this project. Pit, pits and quarries and some would be temporary again, some would be permanent. And the purpose of those, of course, is to provide the material to build the road with. The gravel and that kind of material, smaller stone, maybe riprap stone as well, to build the road and protect to use for erosion control as well too. Um, there would be construction camps. We've identified 4 different locations for construction camps along the 107-kilometer road. Now, these camps would typically include um, storage and laydown areas, which is where equipment and materials are stored. And then the camps also have their own infrastructure associated with them, such as a small water treatment plant to clean the water, to make it drinkable, and then a storage tank for drinking water. Um, and that's sort of the what you call the ancillary infrastructure or the additional infrastructure that would be associated with the road. So Jen, let's move now into environmental management plans and talk a bit about
Okay.
what these are, because every large project has one of these. And these, and we'll get into this a little bit more later on, are getting more and more critical to a project. They're getting more detailed.
And with
So
this
these
one,
have
we're
gone,
kind of looking at two separate ones, right?
well, yeah, exactly. You're right, Jen, because these are based on different phases of the project, right? So there's a construction. environmental management plan, a CEMP, and an operations environmental management plan. And as you know, the activities during the different phases are not always the same, right? So as a result, you have two different plans. So the plans are really sort of a way of providing sort of really clear direction to the construction teams and the operation teams in that phase, so that they know exactly what they need to do when they're in different areas and how to, like, the
Right.
different
In
protocols, the
a
different,
safe and responsible way.
in a safe and responsible way, right? And like an environmental management plan, and you and I are going to talk about this. It's a plan, but within that there are many other plans, right? And we're going to go through like a laundry list of the types of plans that would sit within the environmental management plan. So it's sort of the overarching thing. These are not small
Hmm.
documents. And like I said, they're getting larger and more complicated all the time, especially on a project like this, right? Where you have indigenous communities and they have their own, right? They've identified sensitive areas, and they have they've identified things that are important to them, and these hopefully get captured in the environmental management plan, right? And if they're not,
Right.
they're certainly enforced at the construction stage and in the operation stage, right? And we'll get into that, through using community environmental monitors, right? Who can look out for um, things that are important to community members. It could be
Lots of
many
things:
different things, right?
cultural values, water, everything.
Absolutely,
Fish,
right?
and I
Things
know
like
we're
that.
going to talk
How
about
to
that a
deal with
little
dead
bit later.
animals. Yeah, like things
Oh,
like that. Even
that's
things like
important.
how
Yeah.
to deal with dead animals appropriately, right? Things like that. So it takes a lot of different forms. So let's move to the next slide and talk a bit about what would normally be, like, what would the sections be in an environmental management plan? Like I said, it's not a small document, it's a big one. So you'd have a description of the project, and then you'd identify roles and responsibilities. So you'd have the list of all the people and their roles, what they're responsible for in the project. You'd have contact information, because this is like the ultimate guidebook to the project, right? Um, you would have environmental and cultural awareness and education. So the idea is, um, there, if there, especially if there's communities in the area, indigenous communities in the area, what you would do is you would work with those communities and gather information to make sure that the workers, some of whom may not be from that area,
Hmm.
are aware of what is culturally appropriate, right, and how to conduct themselves.
Yeah,
And
we
I
did
think,
that.
Jen, you can talk
Yeah,
to
we
that
definitely
from
did that.
experience, right?
And yeah, and something that would likely happen with that is that that would be developed in community, because it's very
Yes.
important to have local cultural awareness, because we all have different protocols working
Yeah.
across Turtle Island. So in Henvey, for instance, we developed a pretty big wind farm on our land. So with that, the chief thought it was very important that anyone working on our land, in addition to taking the site orientation training, that cultural awareness training was important, and knowledge of Anishinaabeg protocols. So that's
Yes.
what we rolled into there. So there's one thing, knowing Indigenous history in Canada, but it's very important when you're in someone's territory to have a good understanding of their protocols, so that everyone understands each other moving forward.
That's a great point. And that, we'll get into this a little bit later on, but that's where the importance of having local environmental monitors involved in the project too, right? Because they can, not
Hmm.
only can they provide, enforcement and compliance with the EMP, but they can also, I mean, part of that is also cultural awareness and ensuring that that respect for the land, or whatever is part of the training with the cultural awareness training, um, is reflected in how the workers conduct themselves, right, when they're on
That's
site and
right.
they're doing the work. So that's why it's important to have community member participation on the implementation end of projects, right, on the construction end of these projects, to make sure that that happens. So just some of the other things that would be in an EMP, you would have health and safety, obviously, environmental protections and controls. That's a big part of it. And then what we call the component management plan. So individual plans for different topics, and I'll get into that
Hmm.
um, in a minute as well.
And even with many of
And
those things, cultural protocols can be worked into those individual component management plans when we're dealing with some of the
yes,
different aspects.
that's right. Why don't we talk a little bit now about what information's in an EMP? We can
Okay.
move to that slide. That's the next slide.
I know it seems really daunting because these are such large documents, but when we break
Yes,
it down into bite sized pieces, that makes things a lot easier.
it does. It does. But it is such an important document, right? And yeah, you're right. It is intimidating, when people see these things and say, okay, just make sure you follow everything in this giant book, right? But that is a little scary. But
It is.
once you get, and because it's got a lot in it, right? Like let's looking at this slide now. Look at some of the stuff that's in there. You have a management plan, objectives. You have
Hmm.
management strategy, uh,
Scheduling,
guiding documents, everything, right? Like you're right, scheduling, project roles, performance
performance
indicators.
indicators. What does that mean?
That's a good question. So it could be a lot of things, right? Like anything that would help identify that the contractor's doing what they're supposed to do. So,
Okay.
okay, let me just give you some examples. So, like whenever there's like a spill, for example, right? Even if it's a small volume of oil or whatever. Say, for example, they did an oil change on a bulldozer, and some just a tiny bit of oil maybe got got onto the soil or wherever it was being changed. So technically speaking, you would scoop up that soil and bag it, right? And then it has to be disposed of appropriately, right? So it goes in a special container, right? So, and all that
Right.
has to be reported. So you have this log of all these activities, right? So something like that happened, it would all get logged. So it's that sort of record keeping side of things, like we do with a record of consultation on a
Hmm.
project. Same thing on the compliance end. So all that stuff has to be recorded. There's
Cleaning
usually,
up after rock
monthly.
trucks.
Yes, yeah. Um, so there's a lot of different ways to assess performance of a contractor through an EMP, right? Because you can say, okay, how did they manage that issue, right? Okay, there was a bit of a small oil spill of just a few milliliters of oil. Did they handle it responsibly? Did they put it in a designated container? Will that then be disposed of and in the appropriate location? That kind of stuff. What's your record
Hmm.
keeping like? All that kind of stuff. Just so that, the proponent or, whether it's a regulatory authority can just say, okay, show me what you've been up to, right? I want to see and make sure that you've been applying all these rules that are in your EMP effectively to make sure that nothing bad happens. So that would be what I mean by that. Monitoring requirements, there sometimes this is in a separate document, right? But there are
Hmm.
typically when an EA or an IA is approved, you'll get there might be monitoring required, whether it's water or soil or whatever, for a certain period of time. Whether it could be forever, like the lifespan of the road, but there are monitoring requirements, and these you have to record information as to the monitoring you're doing and the results you're getting, and those have to be available for review by
Okay. So
regulatory
that one's a little
agencies.
longer term than having
Yes.
physical or environmental monitors on site. So these monitoring program would be a little bit more permanent fixtures
Yeah.
along the road, right? Okay.
Typically, like, there would be monitoring during construction, but then there's post-construction monitoring, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes it could go for a certain period of time, like 5 years post-construction, or sometimes it's indefinite, right? It could go on for, depending on the sensitivity of the area, maybe it might be indefinite monitoring to be able to catch situations where, uh-oh, something's wrong here, right? Something happened. We
Hmm.
got to take a look at this and figure out what we can do to mitigate. There was an issue. How do we mitigate the issue, right? That kind of stuff. Reporting requirements. I mean, I know on some projects I've worked on, there's monthly reporting, environmental reports that are done monthly, where they would include, um, quite often they'll include like the daily environmental reports, right? Because there's
Hmm.
always, for most projects I've worked on, there's daily reports that are done. So all those records would be, compiled and put in the monthly report. So, there's a lot of reporting involved in this process. There's a lot of
Hmm.
oversight that occurs. It's not just going out there and, building the road and, not paying attention to anything else.
Oh,
It's
that's it. I
far
remember in
more.
my area we had test wells for water,
Yep,
so that they we were given the reports for those test wells once a month. I don't remember how many there were. I think there were 5 or 6 of them in the area because we wanted to ensure that we could monitor the aquifers. And so we also
yes,
negotiated with the province to continue monitoring those wells for a number of years after construction was complete of the
yep,
highway through our area, because sometimes you don't know if there's something that happened that might be so small but end up having a
yep.
longer term effect, right? So we wanted to make sure we could keep track of that.
Because in a project like that, you're drilling big boreholes for the foundations for the towers, right? You're
Hmm.
building access roads to the towers, right? And so, there's potentially impacts on groundwater. So you've got to have those wells there to, like you said, to figure out what's going on. Has the groundwater regime or environment been affected by this disturbance, right? By these access roads, by the construction of the of the towers, right? Like that kind of stuff. So yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
makes total sense. Corrective actions. Okay, that's another thing that's in an EMP. What did the contractor do to correct the issue, right? All that stuff gets recorded. And then, of course, maps and site plans. And especially on linear projects, you've got this really long stretch, 100, like in our case, 107 kilometers long. Areas are different from each other, right? In terms of the how the road might be built, in terms of the environmentally sensitive features, in terms of the land type, whether it's muskeg or esker, things like that. So maps more and more are playing a key role, or a key part in these environmental management plans. So, depending on where you are, there might be a different set of guidelines to follow or rules to follow. If we can move to the next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit now about the types of plans that could be in an EMP. We're looking at a project like this. Here's some of them, maybe not all of them, but some of the types of plans that would sit within the environmental management plan. So air quality and dust control, right?
Hmm.
Archaeological resources. How do you deal with those in the course of construction and operations? Blasting, um, traffic
That was a big
management.
one in my community,
The blasting
the blasting.
or traffic management?
Just blasting.
Yeah, yeah, because I guess there was a lot of that was done for the road access. Was that for the construction of the roads, Jen?
No, this was a Ministry of Transportation highway expansion that was going just around just off reserve boundaries, and so they
Okay.
were blasting for the road. And so sometimes there's, as you know, there's different provincial legislation in place for
Yep.
the size of the blast or the vibration of the blast. And then
Yeah.
there's also, and we want to say this is community acceptable standards as well, because there was a few blasts that we had that actually shook people's houses in the community. I remember I was walking
Wow.
out the door and my hair actually kind of blew back from one of these blasts, and
Jeez.
it was
Wow.
I think about 2 kilometers away from my house. So I immediately phoned the project guys, and we checked the blasting monitor immediately, but it was still within the allowable limits under provincial guidelines. And I said, well, you need to keep track of that close to here, because that wasn't acceptable to my community. And so you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
work some of those kinds of things in when the road is closer to community, and blasting may affect um, the community.
Yeah, that's a really good story, actually. That's really interesting. Um, well, even things like waste management, right? How do you handle construction waste as well?
Oh, that's
Employment and
another one.
procurement, right? There's another employment and procurement plan. Are you going in, and especially when you have indigenous communities around, does the contractor have any obligations, or what are how is it going to conduct itself in terms of procurement? Will it try to maximize opportunities for local community members to participate in the project? So, that kind of plan could sit within an EMP. Um, Again, environmental cultural awareness and education, erosion and sediment control, fish and habitat management, health and safety management, noise and vibration. If we move to the next slide, like light management, petroleum handling and storage is a big one. Vehicle and equipment operations and maintenance, site restoration, spill prevention and emergency response, surface water and stormwater management, soil
That's a
management,
lot.
vegetation management, wildlife management. Lots of stuff, eh? Lots of different plans. And again,
And
you and I
all of
were
that to
discussing this.
say, yeah, and all of that to say that they're like every aspect is looked at to ensure that
Yes,
everything, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, is done in a safe and responsible way, as well as
that's right.
being up to community standards, right?
Yes. And I think the important thing to get across to our viewers is that an EMP, or environmental management plan, is what you call a living document. It's always changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is there's sort of a generic, sort of like a basic one that starts off. Then as the project is designed, right, and you learn more about, and the as the design advances and gets more detailed, the environmental management plan gets more detailed as well too, because we know more, right,
Right.
about the areas through which or in which we would be working. So, it gets more detailed, but it's always changing, right? There's maybe community members might raise something during construction and say, hang on, I think we need to better deal with these situations, right? And then there's a meeting, and they might do a revision to the EMP. And
That's it. In our
so,
area we had like the dead animals kind of thing, and
yep,
in our area we're also home to Massasauga rattlesnakes. So there's certain times of the year where you have to be really careful, so we had a much slower speed limit, and if there were fatalities of the Massasauga rattlesnake, they were picked up, and there was an identified community member who would take those on, except they had other certain things to do before they passed
yeah,
them over. Yeah, so there's some things.
yeah. I remember one community in northwestern Ontario I work with. They had a protocol for when, if a dead eagle was encountered during
Oh,
construction of,
absolutely.
of anything, right? Because it
Hmm.
represents something special in to community members. There's a different way of handling them. There is for almost all animals, aren't there, Jen? But
Yeah,
eagles in
there's
particular,
certainly
right? They had a
there would
protocol
certainly be
for that.
ceremony around that
Yes.
included.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. So anyway, there are many plans within the EMP. And we'll get
There are many
into in
plans within the
future
plan.
plans within the plan, subplans, yes. So we're going to get into those, down, a few weeks away. We'll start to dive into more deeply into some of these selected plans, just to give people some more detail when it comes to things like a wildlife management plan. What does that mean, right? Give them a better
Hmm.
idea of that. So, one last section I wanted to cover, just to help people understand what we mean by mitigation measures, or measures to minimize project impacts, is I thought we'd take something that most people have probably seen when they drive by construction sites, and that's erosion and sediment control mitigation. So people have probably seen on construction sites these sort of fabric type fences that are set up um, typically along the perimeter of a project. And this, if you look at the slide on the screen here, what I'm showing you here is erosion. So erosion is, eroded soil is called sediment. So when that soil moves from its where it was originally in its position, and then for whatever reason, whether it's from from water or wind, and when it gets displaced or moved, it's called sediment. And so when that gets into waterways, as you can see on the picture on the left there, and the one on the right, it changes the environment, the aquatic habitat, by reducing the clarity of the water, and then that can cause negative impacts on many, if not most, fish species as well too. So the question is, what do you do when you have these kinds of situations? You do not want this situation to occur. So if we
Absolutely
work,
not. And then the
not
other
at
thing, when
all.
they do the water working, there's certain times a year where they don't do any water work, they
Yes,
call it, because of fish spawning and stuff like that. So they
you
want to
got
stay
it.
away from the water at those times of year. And then again, they put in that protection so you're not mixing in any of that sediment. And if there's any other sites, um, sacred sites and other things that people would like protected, those can absolutely be worked into a plan. For instance, in my
Totally.
territory, we had pictograph sites. And so there were a lot of extra controls put in place so that construction stayed a good distance away from the site so that it remained untouched.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and although all you have to do is just make sure they're identified and you describe, and then the team will work out a way to mitigate, to
And put
eliminate
a
or
buffer
reduce
zone.
impacts to those areas and put a buffer zone around
Hmm.
it, basically. Keep away from this area kind of thing. So if we look at the next slide here, this one shows stream bank erosion, right? So you've got an exposed slope there where there's been obvious erosion there on the right bank. And so what they're doing there is they're putting down an erosion control blanket to keep the soil in place. And then what they do is they put stone over top of it to, like riprap stone, smaller stone over top of it to protect the shoreline, weigh down the blanket and protect the shoreline to prevent the water from washing away in the soil. So I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen these kinds of projects along waterways as
Yeah,
well
and
too. And
and the rocks being used, of course, are coming in locally, so it's not like they're being trucked in from the south.
that's right.
So you don't
Yep,
have to
that's
worry
right.
about cross contamination.
Exactly. So those would be mined, from the quarries, right? So they would blast the bedrock to get and then you do crushing to get that size of rock, that
Hmm.
riprap size of rock.
Rip rap,
If we
say
can
that
move to
again
the
and again.
riprap size of rock, don't ask me to say it more than once. That would be tough. This next slide is something you've probably seen before on construction sites. That's that
Yes.
fabric fence I was telling you a bit about. So that black fence there is a fabric. It's actually buried underground there, partially, and the point of it is to prevent soil loss or erosion, and from that getting into typically to prevent it from getting into water courses and causing what I talked about before, changing
Hmm.
the aquatic habitat by reducing the clarity of the water by making it more turbid or unclear. Next
Or
slide.
muddy,
Or muddy. Yes, muddy. Yeah,
muddy
that's it.
looking.
Good word.
Oh,
Muddy looking.
here's a good
Yeah, this is
picture.
a
You
good one.
really
I
see
like
the
this one.
difference. Yeah,
So this is what
you
you
really see
see
the
here
difference
is
between that.
this was that picture. If we go back to it for a sec, is in water work. So for example, putting in bridge piers, right in the water, like if you're putting in a big steel pier in the middle of a water course, you would put down one of these things called like a turbidity curtain or a silt curtain, and the idea is to contain, the disturbed soil within an area, and then to collect that and remove it so that it doesn't cause like permanent or even temporary impacts to the aquatic habitat. So you'll see these sometimes as well too. That's another technique that's used. And then if we can move to our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit, and Jen, feel free to jump in, about environmental enforcement and compliance. So I've talked a little bit previously about environmental monitors and the roles that they play in sort of enforcing, serving as sort of the policing tool for the environmental management plan and making sure that what's in that plan is enforced and complied with. And what's happening more and more on projects, um, and particularly projects that impact community members, what's happening more and more is community members are being hired to serve
Hmm.
in these roles, which is fantastic, right, Jen? Because you know they bring a different perspective in terms of their land. This is their homeland. They view it in a different way, which is good. So they provide that sort of extra level of protection, even beyond what's in the EMP. So you're seeing this happen more and more. These are really good jobs, and I think Jen, you've got examples of environmental monitors working on projects that you've been involved with, right?
Sure, I have a few. So for the environmental monitors, typically they'll be hired and trained. And that's not to say that our Anishinaabe knowledge is not utilized. It absolutely is. And we just do some safety training with folks. And then one of the things that we used to use the environmental monitors for, particularly the Anishinaabe environmental monitors, is they would go into an area before construction and do a sweep. So that's ensuring, there's no species at risk in the area, that things were identified, according to the plans effectively, and then making sure if there's any areas where we need to be implementing a buffer zone, that that's also looked after, and then construction can continue into that area. And of course, they monitor the construction activity, so making sure that in the case if there is an oil spill, that it is cleaned up properly and all of those things are followed. So one of the other things we had in our area was what we called highway inspectors, and we hired a number of people, and they don't have to have their certification at that moment. So what we did was hired them. They did hands-on training with other qualified highway inspectors, and then we helped qualify them to become junior inspectors. And that training is provided through the Ministry of Transportation, as well as those courses. And then, that qualifies people to, if they want to, because there are going to be potentially other roads built in the region, go work on those roads as well with those certifications. And same with the environmental monitoring
Yeah.
experience. That's pretty important. You can jump on other jobs as well to ensure the protection and safety and everything's done in a safe and responsible manner and according to our Anishinaabe and cultural values.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Jen. Like it's these are really important jobs, right? And but those skills are so transferable, like you said, right? Look at that
I have one
example, you
dog.
know.
Sorry, her
It
name is
sounded
Xena.
like more than that. Yeah.
I know.
She's loud when she wants to be, eh?
Yeah, I forgot to turn my mic off. I'm sorry, guys, listeners,
I thought somebody
Don,
was at the door,
Tony.
and that's why she was barking. But
Delivery, it's Friday.
there we go. It's the Friday delivery. Yes, yeah. Well, that was great, Jen. That wraps up today's discussion about minimizing project impacts. We hope this was helpful, and we hope it encourages you to come back and join us again next week at the same time when we're going to talk about employment opportunities from project facilities such as construction camps. So remember, I talked a bit about
Hmm.
that before. So that'll be a good topic. I think you'll find that interesting. And again, don't forget to keep in touch with us and our project team members via the contact information available on our website. And you can contact us at supplyroad.ca. There's lots of information on our website about the project. Again, if you have questions, ask me. Feel free to ask me, and we'll get back to you for sure. So, miigwech, and we will talk to you again next week.
All right, Chimigwech.